Hello everyone, today we talk about 12th century Western knights, highlighting especially certain aspects concerning their armament and tournaments, as well in a broader technical context, which Western knighthood at this point was developing together in general with the rest of the equestrian and also foot military culture. At this point in history, you know that this century especially was extremely tumultuous, brutal in many ways. The Western civilization was booming in so many ways, but it's also the moment to which the foundations, like the institutions, the regulations, for especially these veritable panzers of the time that really could not find anyone stopping them but their own equivalent, was concerned. And for many reasons, today we will not look at things like the peace and truce of God. I made videos about that. It's not a history of violence per se, it's mostly like a history of knightly technique. You know that we, however, addressed like all the moral, cultural, and personal, elements that contribute at this time, especially in the third fourth of the 12th century, to lock knighthood, to establish some greater hierarchy within the nobility. I just recently made videos about like the role of the minor noblemen in European armies and warfare. I made lots of videos about medieval French warfare, and even more in particular like the organization French armies, mostly from slightly later period, but we addressed, of course, this immediate prelude, which, especially again in the last quarter of the 12th century, would dictate much of also the later developments. We also observed these knights in actions in different battles, especially during the Crusades, but we will open to more battles of the 12th century. It's not even just strictly the 12th century. Some things we will discuss from the mid-11th, like it's, as you understand, the gradual process, right? The one of the development of Western knighthood as we sort of understand it. Across these high medieval centuries, after all, there hadn't been such a radical change, even in the material side of the story. Like knights in the 13th century looked pretty similar, at least in the essential panoply, to even the ones of Charlemagne, right? But aside from the obvious changes also in that side, it can help us realizing, of course, better what trajectory this change was following. There is all a major military collective discipline imposed to essentially reform the miles, the individual warrior, emerging from the mists of the migration era with all their mysticism and practices and beliefs, and channeling this force into a civilizational army that in fact would literally crush basically anything that stood in the way as a process. So again, there are so many different angles you can look at this from. Today we stick mostly to things like cavalry charges, how, say, the certain basic aspects of how, of course, like the panoply of the time evolved to adapt to these new challenges and contexts, and also how these troops notoriously trained themselves in this early era. That was not like the sort of the gentle joust of the later Middle Ages, but as a matter of fact, something much more brutal that was practically identical to real battles, right? People believe that sometimes like tournaments were just some mock combat of sort. No, these people literally killed each other. Aside from devastating the surrounding countryside with private property within, in ways that in fact had always been there and that were really a direct continuation of politics by other means. Literally, these encounters were not just, okay, like there is war as we normally wage it, and then, these are just, yes, violent, even mortal point training, but basically different. Now, they were in many ways the same thing. Like they had this people had always to test one another, to rely on one another. Every sort of incident, every kind of affront had to be washed in this way. So there was a real conflict, a real competition, even within the same friendly ranks, and this was essentially the best way to even just make this knight, right? I already addressed in many videos what knightly training technically was. In the sense, actually, from a spiritual point of view, from a moral point of view, it's something that you do not want to hear. What it meant to become a knight, right? You were essentially annihilated as a human being, and of course, reformed into a man, but through one of the single most sheerly traumatically brutal and traumatic ways that you can ever imagine. And these men, we know it from so many different indicators in the sources, would remain, definitely altered for the remainder of their often short as violent life, to say the least, but making them the veritable spearhead of civilization and essentially incarnating the highest model of almost holy warriorhood, aside from sort of how the Crusades reclothed, especially, as you know, with Bernard of Clairvaux, like you have probably the distinction of a new knighthood, of the Nova Militia, that should have, in fact, reinvigorated some spiritual standards rather than any technical ones, right? Say the same monastic chivalric orders were, these knights were completely identical from a material, technical point of view to any other knight, but of course their elite was due to the sheer magnitude of the fanatic devotion to self-sacrifice in holy combat, according to the fullest evangelion of the imperial Catholic Indo-European tradition. And people do not really often understand what this even means. You still have people reaching out saying, I don't understand, you said that, like, the Romans created Christianity, like, things like this, because I say that, Catholicism predates Christianity. Well, if you don't know that, it is a problem. I will just say that, given that I uploaded so much stuff on it by now, that just, people listening for 30 seconds and pretending to understand, academic content of 2 hours and a half, in length, is not really the way like a fully developed human being is supposed to behave, just saying. But this is the beauty of Schwerpunkt in many ways, and that's why we like to sort of provide with all the stuff, because you see, this content piles up, right? Another channel would just make a video about 12th century knights once and say, okay, well, I'm not going to make it anymore. First of all, because they exhausted what they feel themselves like more or less the topic is about. Secondly, because they think that people are not going to watch, any further update. But here on Schwerpunkt, we can make even hundreds of videos like this. We already made, for example, like an abundance of military historical units videos from 12th century Western European knights, not only, by the way, that can work as a general introduction. In any case, last thing, I remind you, I have a medieval knighthood playlist, so if you're particularly interested in that, like in knightly warfare, I highly recommend you that playlist. So we should make a bit of order at different levels. That's why we need to explain at some point, like a bit the historiography on knighthood, because there are specific steps in the development of this veritable military class that really starts saying a pretty, not necessarily unanimous, but the point is that you may find statements like from Fleury that the knightly class sort of developed just, or was born like in, say, the 12th century. No, that's not what happened. Like the 12th century, again, in the second half of it, was essentially the lock of chivalry. The idea that if you are a higher nobleman that can afford like the very expensive and publicly recognized ceremony of dubbing, you were a higher part of the establishment and sort of the entire kingdom's asset. Because as you know, that national monarchies start to impose themselves as states exactly at this point, and especially countries like France and England, they're a bit like the champions of chivalry in a technical sense at this point. And of course, like other countries are, it's not like, I don't know, the Germans or the Spanish, the Italians are less, but there are some codes here. It's important, some societal norms, like what we intend as chivalry, right? Could have not been developed, but of course, in a country like France, and in a similarly run one like England, was a Frankish power, given the Norman conquest at this time as well. And very much, as you know, there was a lot of traffic, let's put it in this way, across the channel, where so few people would have enough wealth to literally train or to live like as knights for their entire lives. What we know of people fighting in tournaments at 80 years old still, because literally once you were into it, it was only about this. And this had already been the case before, right? Again, nothing new really. It's not something developing at the time. In warrior tribal cultures, this had always been the case. Now, you understand that there is something different, and that the same knight is becoming so expensive that it really entails like an apparatus for even being fielded to begin with, right? So in the 10th century, you really have the affirmation, also from really the lower echelons of the European establishment, because as you know, at that point, like the empire and pretty much like any kingdom existed, but still in some sort of theoretical fashion, public authority was severely undermined, and that's where that class from basically the humans of Europe were called to rule over the humans of Europe from a local standpoint, formed to the point that across especially post-Carolingian Europe, basically every knight was alike, like could recognize himself into another, say across the Alps or from the Atlantic to Central Europe, because they were basically the same people, right? And they were in this sense more important than the others in terms of lineage, of power, of political control. Again, every country in Western Europe has its own story, right? The Germans have the servile knights. The Italians have the census urbanized ones. You have the caballeros villanos in Spain, right? France is, again, like the utmost, let's say, greatness. England has some more interesting regulations, because at least initially it's a more sort of centrally ruled system. Of course, here the system has been expanding. Think about Sicily, etc. So we will, at some point, be more thorough about all these various differences, but we also need to talk a bit more in general. So the specific gear of the knight, right, is just the material reflection of a much higher hierarchy of proper values, right, that are just even following a Clausewitzian concept, like existing there as strategic quantities even before like they're actually enacted, meaning that these people, of course, live in a broader spirit, in a broader understanding of the world that they really display with amazing feats. Like, I don't know, when you look at Godfrey of Bouillon, like what do you think like a Belgian knight knew about Palestine in the 11th century? But these people managed to carry out an incredibly disciplined expedition to reaffirm the imperial Catholic glory, recapturing the holy citadel of mankind, and asserting like the truest, like immediate sort of relation between the cingulum militaris and divine power, right? Think about lesser people today, like now calling people feel they feel threatened by because of authority and power, like warmongers and psychopaths. This is the kind of crawling fourth estate communistic humus, even people that consider themselves conservatives but do not understand to which level of disgusting location they have fallen. Now, this all entailed, of course, like an enormous level of training. The fourth estate at the time was contributing heavily to the sustenance of these knights, right? Their way of life, their conduct, because these were the lords that would defend the local communities. It would expand an actually greater power. Like, it wasn't like they were sitting there and saying, no, now, we will vote, we will get informed now on Twitter because we're special people. No, these people understood that we're lesser people, and as such, they, in the deepest sense, understood why they had to back authority, because they were incapable of handling matters right in their own hands. The 12th century is admittedly also a time of great, given the increasing material wealth of the system, like the moment of the spread of the heresies, in which this scum of the earth basically starts thinking like the usual dualistic agnosticism, that the responsibilizes the lesser person by making them believe that there is an evil counter god, and that it's all a scam, and that they don't have to do anything but die just to earn heaven. Imagine if you're a knight, you're the highest metaphysical incarnation of the imperial Catholic tradition that, again, predates the same Romanity, that all the Indo-European sense of proper nobility stems from, that, of course, especially by the 13th century, will have slaughtered enormous masses of these mentally and physically feeble, because that's, at the end of the day, also what we're looking at. People were incapable of challenging, especially from the second half of the 12th century, heavy cavalry in open combat, right? If you really understand what a cavalry charge is to begin with, first of all, you know that cavalry is fully decisive between the mid-12th and, say, the beginning of the 14th century. It's not even a very long time, but this is exactly when it's affirming, all right? But if you think that, I don't know, shelling or machine guns are more fearsome than a cavalry charge, well, just know that even in some fake charges in movies with actual background actors from the military, that, of course, were not to be invested by the actual cavalry charge. Like, you couldn't make this man, contemporary discipline, stay in line in the age of, assault rifles, etc. When this cavalry was approaching, right? And of course, there was a whole system of beliefs that today it's dispatched by the name of chivalry, which actually doesn't mean much, in the sense that, yes, it's a beautiful name, but it obviously dates back to millennia of equestrian elite European culture that basically every single European people revolve around, including the allegedly republican and democratic Rome or Greece, that of course unfortunately never were, thank God, that all had knights as the exclusive heroes of all their sagas, right? Even among peoples that made like a very scarce use of cavalry because of lack of surplus, especially the northern Germans, the hero is a knight, right? And this is incredibly, I made lots of videos about also ancient cavalry. We'll come back on it soon, also from a spiritual standpoint, from a mythological standpoint, because the religious meaning there is inescapable. You abandon, like, if you think you can study history without religion, throw away all your books. You're done for. You're going to be completely useless as a historian if you think that. And in every single topic, you can study everything. It doesn't matter. If you do not study religion for decades in your life, you're completely incapable to provide any moral and scientific addition to the world. So the type of equipment that knights use, of course, is well recorded. Something that I always point out that is beautiful to look at in a European perspective is that by this point, like, admittedly, this is true also from earlier, but there is an acceleration, right, in the complexity of armor, say, of the world panoply to begin with, but still, something ever more timed in a synchronic fashion in terms of the development of Western arms and armor in a matter of just a few years, meaning that, I don't know, from Poland to Portugal, from Norway to Sicily, from Ireland to Hungary, every single knight fundamentally does not literally have the same identical type of armor, but they start producing largely like their the most updated version all across without any sort of overlordship in Europe, but just because out of the sheer practice, the sheer, of course, intense context that these knights at large had as errant adventurers, soldiers, mercenaries, whatever you want to call them, crusaders at the same time. Make lots of videos in any case about so-called mercenaries that it's a term that I don't like because I think it's very diseducative as far as the actual meaning of the soldiery actually was. But, you know, on YouTube, every time you type mercenary, you get more views, and so at least I explain this every time, right? There is truly an homogeneous sense of military culture in Latin Germanic, and not even at this point. Like, it started from Latin Germanic Europe, now expanded, as we just said, like pretty far and wide, with this entire, say, Romano-Frankish civilization. Needless to say, knights depended on horses, right? As well as both defensive and offensive weapons. I have an entire series about arms and armor, specifically focused on the Middle Ages, that I advise you to look at. Also, I don't know, well, pole arms, weapons that could have been used by knights, say, once they were dismounted, but there was a great deal of infantry development. I will soon make a video about this again. It is crucial to note that the term horses, plural, should be preferably and properly used to, of course, stress how, what we were saying before, that these knights, these men-at-arms, were basically at the center of an almost arms system, right? While 12th century literature often depicts the lone roving knight that belongs a bit to that iconic imagery, and also in art, and this is true also in other cultures, etc. In reality, a knight needed not just several war horses, so destriers, to function effectively, but also lots of other people, right? Infantrymen, missile troops, and more. Like, several war horses, the trade force is excessive in as an individual knight that would have just had, hopefully, like, you know, at least in the heaviest case, a couple. Like, but that would have been extremely expensive. Then we know that you know, lighter mounts were often used and different depending on the tactical function, depending on the type of property of fight to begin with. Knights also did not fight, especially at this point, only on horseback. Not that they would ever do just that, but especially again before the mid 12th century, there was a lot of dismounting, right? Especially in those areas that had not been fully civilized. Like in Germany, for example, the imperial royal army often dismounted, right, in this heavily forested, swampy land that had to be, there was being exactly at this point fully cleared, deforested. But the knight does not fight alone in a broader sense because he's a leader himself, right? So also, this is very underrated because there is a misunderstanding concerning the development of cavalry and infantry, that it is true they were evolving, of course, in function of also fighting one another, but also fighting literally one another, meaning infantrymen against infantrymen and cavalrymen against cavalrymen. And we're talking about also, as we just said, a widely homogeneous military culture all across the continent. So, of course, like most military cultures do, they develop in order to mostly fight against themselves, like in a strictly technical sense, with their standards that are also the highest. Like, they're now beginning also to fully surpass the the Byzantines, the Arabs, right? Up to that point, there had been some sort of, equation, right? The Latin Germanic West never fell behind, even in, I don't know, in the darkest, I don't know, the 7th century, times like that people think of like the Dark Ages. But as a matter of fact, the Latin Germanic West was very, very military capable at the time. As a broader civilization would just tend to catastrophize too much and to pretend that outside of the West, God knows what was there really, like the 4th millennium civilization. No, right? That's not actually the case. In any case, these knights were conceived, as we've seen, with a quasi-sacrificial role, right? The knight had to be prepared for scenarios where a horse might die, get injured, or run away if he were unseated. So still at this point, even though most of the investment was in mounted combat, which was also the single most effective to begin with, because these knights knew, in fact, how to fight in any other circumstance, they would have to literally train for any of these. Remember that knights knew how to use every single weapon available at the time much better than any other element, right? There is not such a thing. You find a footman that is a better archer than a knight because the knight is, just fighting with, crochet lance, the sword. So that knight will be the best archer, right, in the match as well. Just he will functionalize to preferably fight in the most conventional and sort of obviously resounding encounter of open field encounters. There is this notion that pitched battles, or at least open field engagements, were somehow rare in the Middle Ages. This is nonsense, right? If you haven't studied, first of all, like if you literally haven't studied, I don't know, a region of Europe for, say, a couple of generations in medieval times and literally collected all the information available on the single operations that happened, you cannot have an actual idea of that. I know that because I did it. I wrote an entire chapter, 200 pages long, in my doctoral thesis that was exactly about this. I collected multiple thousands of quotes. I don't know whether tens of thousands by that, in that chapter alone, because it was immense. Again, it was mostly about that. The thesis was thrice as long, to realize that, of course, like the open field engagements were, this is even wrong, right? Most engagements were actually in open field, right? It is true that there was a lot of siege warfare, a lot of sort of urban warfare, but it's not like these troops were fighting, just, they avoided open confrontation. The point is that a chronicle will not record if, say, 30 knights clashed against 20 at some point. It doesn't make it into the story. Like, this is the same reason why we think that, in antiquity there were just immense armies with huge battles, and we don't realize that simply they fought pretty much like they would keep fighting until the nation state, pre-industrial times, basically. And just that type of culture would not, for different sensitivities, reasons, etc., actually inform us that there were these kind of clashes, because they literally lived still in a world in which the clash between gods was sort of more out there. The Middle Ages tells you also like the more nitty and gritty side of the story, and so you start having often like more information about the entire picture. But it is not true that open field engagements were rare at all. Like, yes, huge battles with tens of thousands of troops that did really happen more often than we think, were rarer. But for one of those, there were, say, other 10 that normally happen in a way that is simply not historiographically registered, mostly also by us, meaning that if you search for, the war games, those kind of summaries, of editions, so that sometimes are very detailed, even more than legit scholarship. You realize that, of course, they will not tell you all the actual engagements that are there. The only difference is that these wargamers are ignorant, will say, if they don't have some broader literary knowledge will just register a bunch of names for a power, and I tell you by direct experience, that's not how you can understand what the size of scale of that power, how any power mechanism dynamic occurred there, right? And so people simply swallow this stuff, and they think that they are such special people that can quote secondary, tertiary sources and being, military historically literate. That's not right. And the worst part of that is that people who actually are can see that immediately, just by the way you speak, by the way you think, right? The very grossly primitive, cliches and misunderstandings that anybody who has not gone through the thing will display, right? We've seen at the Battle of Bouvines how, for example, the same king of France, once unhorsed, would require immediate aid to prevent his own exposure to enemy foot soldiers. We never talked too much about bodyguards in medieval times, but there was really an incredibly elite physicality as well. It's not just knowing how to use weapons, but being, again, that psychophysical stock that could make you throw yourself into the fray and sacrifice yourself also in somebody else's case. We've seen it at the Battle of Tagliacozzo, for example, with the Angevin marshal, right? It was the knight squire's responsibility to be vigilant and quickly provide a replacement horse normally at that point. And here I will not descend into the technicalities of what the squires really did. We have discussed it here and there, but we'll surely make some more complete videos. But you know that given that these knights are becoming ever more like panzers, like you literally need, like in modern tanks, a guy that spots, one that, at least that commands, another that shoots, another that drives, right? And so these knights ever more enclosed into their helmets, they needed to be ever more protective because of the sheer shock of mounted combat. You need to have squires jumping back and forth across the line saying, look right, look left, and act as one, right? And there was an incredible tandem and synergy among this men. Not talking about the whole units, we will talk about the cavalry charges now. That was unspeakable, right? Medieval knights incarnate one of the highest levels of professionalism that any elite could ever aspire to. This is pure elite culture, right? It's not about lesser people. It's literally about the better people by definition, by actual men, not humans. They're two radically different things, right? Mankind and humanity. They literally believed, of course, to be of a heavenly stock that was mirrored in their blood, in their performance on the field. Much of this culture, in a sense, was in theory because, again, the same knights would fight dismounted at times. There was a lot of siege warfare, indeed, so the necessity of fighting on foot, but preferably the way the world was molded through divine providence passed through these people's vision and will to power. It was obviously wise to keep the war horse reserved for battle, for the main battle, right? Consider that everybody wanted to give their best in these major engagements because the normal way is that these people would die was, rotting alive in some ditch, and at least getting, transpassed in the eye by a lance. So in a major engagement would, cover them in glory, even in the failure of death for that matter. It was a way to really invest in your own house's reputation at Similia. Again, not all engagements obviously were this open ones, right? There were still single individual feats that were very important in cementing that reputation, but at large, those were also different operational and tactical scenarios, meaning that you would want, for example, a more agile horse rather than one that you want to use literally to smash into human bodies out of the sheer power that this enormous mass of several hundred kilos will, literally be launched at. Normally, actual impact occurred at canter, which is something between normally 45 kilometers per hour. But some of these horsemen were so massive, together with their mounts, that they could simply, and they would. We know this happened in the heaviest case with these guys that had even triple layer of armor at pace, because even if you charge at pace, the sheer mass that you're moving in that speed is enough to literally not having a human being in as a single piece in front of you anymore, right? And that's what exactly these people were trained for, through an incredible sheer amount of brutality, psychically and physically, as repeatedly inflicted on them until they became veritable slaughtering machines or died in the process. That's how you became a knight, right? And again, this is not the video which will explain how that technically happened, but it's just a bit faint-hearted. Just know that it's not for you, and it's far beyond what the little story of what, again, people today think knights were just essentially 24 slops, doing aesthetic stuff with armor, as if they were at a reenactment festival, right? One of the reasons that those things are completely useless in a military historical sense is that you will never be any of the sheer psychophysical performance that these men were. Not even close. Literally wearing like them, it's just a materialistic, deterministic superstition. You have nothing of the brain of these people. Nothing. It's not even to say the body. In what the body actually must work like in order to be like this. The mind. You're not there. You will never be. Right? You're just a degenerated, lesser human being from the third millennium. These people would have been disgusted by you, including your ancestors. Right? Because, reality is macroscopically self-evident in front of our own eyes. As we were saying, they would have this different types of horses, such as palfreys, roanses, for travel and transportation. There's a lot of technicality evolving there. There are some differences in Europe. For example, Spain would remain slightly behind in terms, for example, of war horses. Let's say at least distribution for larger medieval armies at the thresholds of the 14th century. But we're not talking about this. Actually, when you look at the Reconquista horses, just for the Frankish ones at the Crusades, in the Levant, we realize that these mounts outperformed the Islamic ones, right? And that the myth, again, of the lighter and catchable Parthian shooting horse archer that puzzles the Westerners and defeats, it's a complete myth, right? And it will explain also now why. Now, at first, the squire who performed these essential tasks of organization by tending to the knight's horses and arms held the status of a simple servant, right? His skills also in combat were pretty modest, but you shouldn't underestimate them, especially as a sort of, normally that they could fight also in different fashion, literally supporting the knight in actual combat with different weapons and also on horseback himself. They were mostly of peasant background, as you understand, but especially in the early days, knights themselves were basically any guy who had the capacity to learn how to use a sword and on horseback, right, in combat and trying that fortune, right? Say not anyone, but next to the traditional elite, again, before the third quarter of the 12th century was a lot of sort of association, of integration, of cooptation, elevation. In the 11th century, the squire's status, in fact, in itself had begun to elevate alongside the knight's growing prestige, even if they remained of a lower rank. For some, serving as a squire served as a training phase before becoming a knight, right? It's, however, essential to recognize that not all squires became knights. Only those hailing from a more exclusive aristocratic class achieved that distinction. Albeit it is true that, especially in the 13th century, the greater affluence and professionalization of the soldiery brought these initial garçons to really become identical from a technical point of view to their masters, if of masters we can simply even speak. I talked about a bit this gradation in the video about the servientes, the sergeants, the sergeant, that illustrates how eventually at that point there is even a further lock with private companies that start essentially selling their service as uniformly heavy cavalrymen, you can say, as knights, except at that point the distinction with the knights is more like of status. If they are dubbed, right, which is an incredibly expensive ceremony that, again, only certain people can afford. And of course, yes, there is still a segmentation, but say who would have the better horse or more horses, etc. But tendentially, by especially the end of the 13th century, you hardly even find any other type of lighter cavalryman. It tells you, by the way, if you think about the sheer cost of this, how insanely powerful Western civilization was at that point. I made an entire video about the overwhelming victory of Western civilization in the 13th century over basically the entire surrounding for good. Now, a knight's defensive armor, as you know, mainly included a shield, scutum or targe. Now, it's useless also to digress because we have seen it in other videos about the types of shields. The most prevalent type in the West during the 12th century, widely spread by the Normans as illustrated in the Bayeux tapestry, had an elongated shape tapering to a point at the bottom. This would gradually reduce because armor, as we'll see now, became ever more performing, so having this piece of, covered and painted wood wasn't really even that relevant anymore. While mounted, the knight would hang the shield around his neck, supporting it with his left arm during charges. You have seen surely the guiches, sometimes the very even complex and original strapping systems that these knights would at some point customize for themselves. The helmets, galea, helmo, of this era were also typically pointed, often featuring an extension to guard the nose, referred to as the nasal. The helm was fastened over the collar of the hauberk, woven mailcoat, made an entire video about chainmail, or the so-called birne, the brune, rather. Essentially a leather tunic studded with stitch plates or metal scales of some sort. See, we talk about the more refined brigandine of the later centuries, but the concept really behind it is really the same. And this was especially a thing when metal was scarcer in the previous centuries. We find very primitive peoples like the Mongols by the 13th century having this incredibly, thick and sort of still mostly organic and sort of a heterogeneous type of armor that, however, was effective as far as their warfare was concerned. That, however, at the end of the day, could not compare with Western equipment as well. I made entire videos explaining why the Mongols could, of course, score remarkable victories, to say the least, over Western, say mostly Central and Eastern European armies at the beginning of the 13th century. So we're not really far from our timeline here, but it's not just about battles. It's not just about single, even territorial conquests. Could be valid from the Western side of the story as far as the Crusades are concerned. So let's make things more historically serious. Now, by the 12th century, hauberk and birnie appeared to denote two separate types of armor, the lorica, as known as such. The advancement of the hauberk, which improved defense against sword strikes, especially those delivered with an edge, albeit to a lesser extent against thrusts, was likely tied to the introduction of new cavalry combat methods, though it remains difficult to pinpoint the exact timeline of these changes, and it's not even that actually straightforward, because it's not even just about the sword rails. First of all, like, people always point out, armor was developing because of crossbows, man. Those damn crossbows pierced everything. It's not like crossbows were not performing, but notoriously, like, if warfare had just been about crossbows, like, there would have been just armies of crossbowmen, and we know, but not just that there weren't, but that, of course, that wouldn't even make any sense, because there were, at the time, like, light troops, more of those later. And so, by definition, they cannot hold the ground, right, against the heavies. And even just heavy infantry as such is more performing against those to begin with. As we were saying before, receiving like a cavalry lance in the face at 90 kilometers per hour, sometimes even more, because again, 45 against 45, that sounds, but some nervous young knights could just give free reins, by the way, endangering the whole formation at some point. Usually, however, the pressure was so great that just in the last 100 meters there was an acceleration of some sort. And you may want to actually look at medieval armor, considering the sheer amount of physical forces involved, like in terms of, well, how do we cope with that specifically? Not just, I don't know, crossbow bolts or swords hit. Like, sword strikes to begin with were at most conceived to literally destroy armor by destroying the same sword, right? Because that's, at the end of the day, what the thing really was. Until, let's say, the appearance, in fact, of plate armor, the swords were seeking to essentially achieve an ever greater cutting capacity. When plate armor comes around, the thing changes, and the swords become bigger, and they mostly trying to destructure. They're still trying to cut through plate armor, and there can be devastating damage also like that, but they're becoming bigger things. And also men-at-arms are ever more equipped with some, I don't know, warhammers, things like that, to properly smash it, to even create damage underneath the armor, which is also a great part of the objective overall. But in all those centuries before, where basically like most armor was chainmail, like, have you ever thought why swords were fundamentally the way they were, and armor was the way it was? Like, they would counterbalance one another, right? There are replicas, testings, etc., that are also so important as they can be. It shows sort of the limit, borderline thing, because knights mostly would use this sword also to chop through softer targets, often using, in fact, things like falchions that weren't much of a peasant weapon, because, without polearm, you could, that actually means that you are heavily armored enough to get into the fray and being relatively invulnerable. And so, again, it's complicated. It's not like peasants have never taken down a knight, but what I mean is that we're talking about a very complex system, right, that mostly escapes also our possibility of historical reconstruction. Again, it's not making HEMA or whatever that surfaces, simply because you're not there to kill people. And please not bring up the nonsense that they didn't kill each other because they were just ransoming each other. They killed each other a lot, right? And then if they captured one another, because when an army is broken, and you can't easily do that without these guys resisting, it's another story that happens also in combat, for that matter, because it was really exhausting to fight in this armor that was all ergonomic, etc. They could make stunts, acrobacies in armor, but it was still exhausting. Still, it is like requiring an incredibly tight energy management control that we also have completely lost the capacity of really testing in actual combat. Again, what you're actually there to kill and get killed, which you can't do in reenactment. Now, in a general sense, it's even not so important to look at these. What was this factor or another? It's a complex system. You can't reconstruct it mathematically. Just read first of all what sources say about battles and try to reconstruct battles, because that's what all the sources point to. The sources do not give a damn, for anybody who has read them and knows that, of course, about what kind of weapons these people were using. All right, it could say here and there that this, unit had been more or less important, but it's always about combined arms. It's about big formations and how they interact with one another. That's what the sources prepotently shout in the ears of people who are still thinking that being an expert in deterministic, materialistic, and individualistic manufactorial issues has anything to do with the expertise in the art of war, even just like the ABC of the art of war to begin with. We should be extremely honest here, because we went on for decades letting these people self-promote themselves while simply cavalcating the incredible underschooling that the average person basically has nowadays, and that should be really violently trained to go under and to learn things by heart for decades before even hoping to get anything like voting rights, which is even a much more radically liberal opinion than anything that ever crossed the mind of a 12th century knight to begin with, right, regarding the role of lesser people. Now, the offensive weapons used by knights are, first, well documented as well. This is not a time which we have any specific... Well, there are some actual issues, like we don't know very much about, especially more like organic material in general, comparisons, how frequent that was, if anything, how much we have to trust iconography, and again, these are also relatively secondary issues, because when you look at arms and armor, there you have essentially the essence regarding the side dish. Like, you can have better or worse ideas, but it's not even that relevant at the end of the day. So by the 11th century, knights had become skilled in using the bow or crossbow themselves. This was incredibly useful in sieges. This notably impressed the Byzantine princess Anna Komnena when the Crusaders arrived in Constantinople. She was all impressed by Bohemond of Taranto, for that matter. We read some interesting excerpts from her father's praise, the Alexiad, in the video I made last spring about the Battle of Dyrrhachium, right? And as you know, I have a lot of Byzantine history and warfare content, so you can always check such videos out. These are meeting points, interestingly enough. And again, today we're not talking performances specifically, but as we were pointing out, this specialization in missile weapons resulted rather in the development among the foot soldiers, the petites, who acted as archers, tasked with bombarding enemy lines with arrows prior to opening a gap for the knights' formidable cavalry charge. This is also not fully what happened. So first of all, we should point out that knights still used, like in the not much in the 12th century, if not at the very beginning of the period, missile weapons themselves, like javelins, that could still be like an equivalent of the spear to a degree. Think about, I don't know, Battle of Hastings, like the typical Norman milice still throwing, javelin into the Anglo-Saxon, the Anglo-Danish feared shield wall in order to test the resistance of that. Not much of the shields per se, but of course of the men behind them. It's the spears that keep the knights away, not the shields. That's just a defensive, a passive protection. Aside from, I don't know, an umbo in the teeth, that is, however, normally what you can do just against another footman. Combined arms tended, so there were also horse archers because we were saying it before, knights were trained to fight as horse archers, like pretty straightforwardly. That's all they did to an extent when they went hunting, and every aristocrat practiced that lifestyle. And it was very easy to do it with human beings as well as game. So it was, again, completely normal, but of course it was much more effective to normally, in the bigger engagements, charge like in open field, in that straightforward muscle to muscle, face to face engagement, to fight with that extraordinary tactics that the shockingly high collective training of these formations were achieving. To say that cavalry charge was formidable is an understatement, right? The way, however, missile troops operated, yes, could be like in waves, like starting the battle, and at that point you have also the enemies using them as well. So the sense, as we said before, is that normally these armies were symmetric in so many ways, and that even when they were sort of different in numbers and composition, they mostly like compensated one another with the same means. Especially the bigger the battle, the more balanced the odds. There is likely at this point, and it's unfortunately undocumented for this time, because chronicles do tell you a lot, but not quite how these battles were actually played out, if not just in particular circumstances, and you never have too many sources to simply confront one another, and they often say, in fact, very different things, at least in a way that you can reconcile them, but only in a realizing that some are just figures, right? Rhetorical expedients or something like that. But more of that, if you're interested in my tactical reconstruction videos, that is what I do for a living, you can always check out the battles playlist. Now, the idea is that knights will essentially start fighting with wings of infantrymen that are, again, unfortunately underdocumented, but it's just like, I don't know, the English Knights of Richard Lionheart with the Italian crossbowmen at the Battle of Arsuf against the Egyptian, Turco-Egyptian horse archery. We suspect that the missile troops were mostly stationed on the wings, and that this notion that knights would somehow have corridors to withdraw behind the infantry, etc. That's true, like this in smaller engagements. In the bigger ones, it's not really how things work. That sort of overly complicates the situation. You can have different spaces to cover, etc. Different times, and it's not that compressed system that obliges you, say, to retreat at every charge behind some infantry line. That would disorder the entire formation. If anything, that can be the case after a rout or a broader withdrawal behind like lines that are supposed to go in battle in their turn, if there is an in-depth deployment. Now, again, I digress because I do not like cliches, and I want to explain to people how warfare really worked at the time for what we can't reconstruct. But in general, we understand that since the best practice is combined arms, there was a way to use, in fact, cavalry and missile troops or infantry, like in different ways, on the same line, right? Since the missile is technically light infantry, they can go back and these are the ones that can go back and forth across the lines. But they can also operate because they're normally less, and because they have, of course, a parabolic trajectory from, say, behind the heavy infantry. It depends also on the ground. Sometimes this is more elevated, and so there are various options. But the sense being that essentially these guys are shooting at either one another or the infantry in the front lines on the wings. Again, it's the first evidence of this kind of tactics is openly just out of 13th century warfare, especially in late. Mostly it's very well documented in Italy because the Italians were the ones that sort of would top that infantry warfare next to the pretty standard cavalry one as well in that period. But we have reasons to suspect that this was going on pretty much all over Europe, and so that the idea was also that between a charge and another, the missile troops would have to shoot at the horses that were very vulnerable. Naturally, they couldn't do that sort of frontally, so they would find, again, a shelter behind heavier lines, etc., but they would also have to fall on the enemy flanks if the enemy wings were broken during the fight that the foot had to necessarily have against one another, and so to start shooting at them from the sides, they were also normally less protected. Together also with the same melee infantry that had to finish off with mostly pole arms and more, sometimes even at closer range with daggers or stuff like the disemboweling the horses, or finishing off the knights with brutal weapons like axes, some early stalks and so on. Now, knights usually resorted to the bow themselves only when fighting as infantry. You have seen it at the Battle of Bourg-Taroul in Normandy, where there is also a slightly more infantry bias at the beginning of the 12th century. We explained in part why this general tendency that the Anglo-Normans seem to maintain sort of for a longer time, but that also disappears basically by the 13th century. And yes, we know that during the 100 Years' War they had very strong infantry, but it's not like they were, say, there is a phase of homogenization of Western warfare by which, I don't know, at the time of Edward I, you would have, or Henry III, you would have like now an English army that undistinguishable from, say, the French one, regardless of any prior sort of Anglo-Danish social segmentation that would maybe have this arm a bit more numerous, or even not necessarily even more performing, by the way, of another. Now, talking infantry specifically. But during sieges, we said it before, knights could delect themselves with these skills. I mean, Richard Lionert got himself killed, like literally in this context, by actually trying to deflect like a guy shooting from like a game almost from a castle he was besieging. But now, starting in the mid 11th century, during cavalry charges, the knight's preferred weapon became the long and heavy lance made of ash, which was held under their arm, the couché lance grip, that starts becoming ever more sort of characteristic of Western cavalry. Really, knights used every kind of grip throughout all the history of cavalry, right? Everything in combat happened. Overarm, underarm, throne, couché, etc. But indeed, this heavening of the mounted fighters brought to this bulkier lances that had to literally like smash, like maintain this stronger, placing, like also in the same system of the knife under the armpit, squeeze under the muscles, and also impacting that much more directly brutal force like with any other sort of sophistication in order to hopefully unhorse or transpass the enemy. And indeed, the force generated from these direct collisions, as we were saying before, was often so intense that it was common for the lance and even the standard it carried to completely penetrate the opponent. And this is often described in the various historical accounts and epics, for example, also among the Arabs, like Ibn Munqid, for example, Life Teachings, Guibert de Nogent, the Just a Day, 744, Fulcher of Chartres, that we read for some of the, in fact, from the very Historia Hierosolimitana. If you need the reference for this, it's 2. There is sometimes a bit of fantasy also in iconography, like, I don't know, falchions chopping through mail, this kind of stuff. Yeah. Everything could technically happen when things were very poor quality, which was more often than not, like for one great masterpiece of a sword, for example, or armor, like would have other 9 that were so. This, of course, does not immediately change the equation. Okay, so a falchion can cut through mail like butter, of course. That's not the case. But especially at great speeds, like lots of things could happen. And in general, like these fighters were not always like in the best attire, with the best equipment, right? Could be very damaged, could be sometimes even just lighter because of even environmental factors. I mean, at the Crusades, they really cooked inside their armor, or at least sometimes heat was so exhausting. Some of these guys, even in face of the enemy, would take armor off. There's several accounts telling this. Even in, I don't know, don't think that summer in Germany is that fresh for that matter. So especially when you're fighting, it's exhausting. We know of some knights literally dying of apoplectic strokes, and not just while, I don't know, like it happened to Barbarossa while he was crossing a river, or just like it happened to Alexander, who almost died because of this, this shocks between, say, fresh water and very intense heat under the sun in armor. We're talking literally just on the spot, right? There were some knights who literally died on the spot because they had so much dehydrated during combat they would have a shock and die on the spot. This does happen, right? It's forgotten largely because we don't see this too often outside, especially actual war, where crazy things happen. With the intensity of elite knightly warfare is something that puts, again, in motion forces that can literally destroy yourself, and that you're called to dominate in order to prevail to begin with. So it's actually shocking, right? It's not surprising that the aforementioned lances often shattered upon impact with shields or hauberks as well, because not everything can be the great hit. They can be deflected. It's difficult, again, at that speed and in such a short amount of time and relatively small surfaces to know where to hit, in spite of the great skill. But that was not the point. The point was surviving, say, the impact, and then hopefully, like, putting the enemy out of combat just per se, either by hitting him or unhorsing him. But as we know, this was often not enough, right? The lance would break, and that's also where the squire would have to bring others at times, and that's when the knights would pass to the sword, right? The Ensis Gladius, and engage in close combat in the frantic melee that admittedly lasted a few. Especially if you were still on horseback, you could get the hell out of the way, and there was all, in fact, a different kind of, say, mounted combat, even in melee, compared to the same dismounted knights' techniques, needless to say. However, regardless of the, again, ideal melee of individual champions fighting in duel that the chivalric epos, and also like the previous ones in other eras, is so often sung in the sources, collective training, like the unit, right? The system was the single most important thing, right? The preeminence of knightly cavalry, of course, is attributed to this single sole concept that von Clausewitz says in a very straightforward way. Like, the best strategy is to be very strong, literally. Like, as he explains, like, warfare is hard, right? It's difficult, but it's not that complex at all, right? You must provide this formidable impact, right? Generated by a tight, synchronized charge conducted in dense formations, the famed convoi. The substantial protection that a hauberk provided to the knight, although the horse remained vulnerable to enemy projectiles, was relative in this context, as we pointed out before. Of course, knights had generally superior quality of the weaponry used by these noble figures, but again, if you have a motorcycle and you just think about what it means, like to smash into something literally at 90 kilometers per hour, like another motorcycle, you know that it's not exactly a recipe for longevity, right? And again, oddly enough, the sources do not talk about the utterly insane amount of cripples, of spinals, etc., that would have, really occurred, like as a result of this regularized conventional warfare across all over, not just Western Europe, like just other peoples had normally less cavalry of this kind, but more or less Eurasia, that was the kind of warfare dominating. And the cohesion and the formation is all right. So in the bigger scheme, like even having overly heavy armor it adds to the punch, but also to the difficulty of the performance. So it's mostly for elite troops as reserves at the end of the battle. The importance here is owned by the cohesion, by acting as a single body, fundamentally. Right. And this dominance was associated with the respect that knights commanded and the widespread acceptance of the emerging rules governing knightly combat in the West during that period. Right. There was really no power that could stop them. Right. Today we can just with tanks, planes, helicopters, you can do a lot of combined stuff. At the time, there is nothing stronger than a thickly packed shock cavalry unit of heavily drilled professional knights. And if you again want to stop them, you have just to oppose another to them. Right? There's literally nothing else. Like also infantry can do that much. It's, as we've seen, heading towards a complete subordination to cavalry on Western battlefields, right? And even when this doesn't happen, it's not because the locals are stronger, actually because they're weaker and do not allow for, even as a broader land, to sustain much heavier cavalry. Look at, the Celtic fringe in the northwest, or the Baltic, or any place that was sort of crucially underdeveloped. In any case, the West dominates even on these fringes, and so it's really that brutal, and it does pass through these packs of horsemen that really echo the war bands of antiquity as wolves, bears, or something. Now, the societal endorsement, as we were pointing out in our ramble against lesser peoples, of course, was crucial. The point I wanted to make before is that, of course, at the time, there was a corporative understanding of why society was ordered in a certain way. It's not like peasants were particularly meek. On the contrary, peasants were the single most radically and viciously, violently evil people in the entire history of mankind all the time, right? And that's also why they got destroyed, like imbeciles, because they didn't know any better. The knights had this discipline, code of conduct, right? If you don't have a discipline, if you do not accept hierarchy and authority, you cannot afford to have anything in your life to any extent, right? And at the time, the difference with today's lesser people, and lesser people today do not even understand this, right? Lesser people at the time understood that they were in that situation and that there was that much they could do, and at large they also needed horsemen because they often fought alongside them against, say, the next local rival mob boss that terrorized their countryside from a distant, a close but not so close castle. And so they would require this mafia protection to the next knight that could help them, that had a seigneury over them and would become more powerful. And that's exactly how the state on the longer run is formed, also to crush the scoundrels of brigands and other people that thought to be living just like in the olden times. But social endorsement was crucial at this point. You can't argue that everything revolved around knights, right? I will have to make a video about the cost of knighthood. Like, because it's not just fodder for the horses that are animals eating a unbelievably large amount of food, right? And that are actually that powerful, but also delicate. In many ways, they need just that type of food and very clean water, and they're incredibly resilient. They can even make 150 kilometers in a day to some extent, but if they're crippled, they're done for. And this would happen so often in battle because, as we were saying before, like, the horse was not even that protected. And the reason why it wasn't is actually the measure of cavalry superiority, because basically even if some horse was hit, say, by crossbow bolts during the advance under, like, in the open, that was irrelevant compared to the sheer shock that they could deliver, that was disproportionately superior that any concentrated missile fire could ever dream to achieve. Like, we're talking in the scale of the hundreds, right? Mostly was about channeling these forces and cooperatively acting with one another and eventually attacking. Then, as we were saying before, attacking for the flank would increase, like, the effectiveness of missile warfare. In that sense, it was because there had been a heavy element of the infantrymen that had already fought against one another. You understand how it works, right? But you could, in a sense, mathematically picture that, even if you don't have the exact quantity, as we were saying before, you can understand how devastating a cavalry attack really was. And that's the reason that the system worked, because everybody understood that investing in that was the way to go, right? Even just to stabilize the system, right? And without this, but as we were pointing out before, like, again, peasants would work, they would break their backs throughout all their life to subsidize, like, to support these people, and that would literally fight, as we'll see now, literally all their life, either in tournament or in actual war. There was no difference between the two whatsoever at this time in history. And so it's an enormous cost, but there is also the one of indoctrination. I mean, how do you have a crusader literally conquering Jerusalem if you don't indoctrinate him, right? If you don't have priests also maintained by the laboratories for preaching, for praying, like, in general, like, for creating the societal bonds. We've seen it basically in every video about medieval Christianity, that without which you cannot really understand anything about Middle Ages whatsoever. So without this societal control, the knightly superiority would have not been as pronounced, but especially since it happened, you realize that it was the best system that temporary balance and direction would provide. For a cavalry charge to succeed, both opposing forces had to engage in a direct confrontation. In the absence of such alignment, the charge could lead to an effective advance. It was very typical of the younger, less experienced, and more nervous knights that had to prove themselves to, first of all, to be deployed in the posterior ranks, so not to create issues. Like, the first ones would always be like the stronger cavalrymen, the more experienced ones, but they would have to be pressed into the formation by the Rotmeister that would, like, follow the charges, were grizzled veterans, like, that had seen it all before and would shout to this or that horseman to remain in line. It was really a thankless job sometimes, because we know that not even kings at a point were obeyed. It was always this fanatic competition between the various elements that was the toughness and the unruliness that made these men in many ways. The Byzantines were shocked to see in their crystallized world of honors, of ranks, whatever, how the Crusaders, the Franks arriving at Constantinople, were just barely obeying, like, a greater authority, but being them as an establishment, the authority over this massive system that the West really was. So there is so much regarding the technicality of a cavalry charge. At some point I will have to explain how they were actually carried out, because it's really relevant to understand, like, all the perfection of this execution like what it entailed and how beautiful, if anything, also it really was. That's also where you have the encounter between the Crusader Knights and the Turks that fought, as you know, in slightly different ways. I mean, they always had the shock-heavy elite element, sometimes very, very elite, like the steppes Turks, like even still the heavily Persified Seljuks had a great deal of autocratic elite power concentration, and basically the rest of the troops were all just horse archers, right? And so this is actually not a great position to attack the Crusaders from, because even though, of course, in a broader moral struggle you can have different outcomes, from a strictly technical point of view, the fact that you don't have a heavy enough cavalry to confront, in fact, the opponent, that even if it has instead a heavier one, in this case, this could happen also in antiquity when infantry was the queen of battles in the West, and still steppes, peoples were sort of at the outskirts of this war they couldn't break through, would oblige you to carry out, to admit this inferiority. Notoriously, we've seen it in so many videos, that the Turkic cavalry would hurl javelins from a distance and then feign a chaotic retreat to disrupt the pursuers before launching a flurry of arrows while withdrawing, often turning their horses mid-gallop. Right? The reason why they use javelins first is the same reason we said before, the Normans at Hastings would do that against the Third, because javelins are actually very, very, very good anti-armor weapon at close range. And then you do this feat of bravery of, approaching a heavier knight that naturally is not scared by a javelin as is scared by another knight, right? Smashing into him at full gallop. And so he cannot simply chase you at every single time. So the reason why actually the knights wouldn't chase them is that they still had an advantage over these lighter troops that would still skirmish and use arrows that are even actually less performing than javelins, especially when these guys are retreating. But they can always be nasty, right? But yet when you see how many arrows were actually shot, sometimes Turco-Mongol armies at a point would use hundreds of thousands or even millions of arrows in a single battle, at least the bigger ones, of course, that would bring with them all that much. You realize that the overall losses from these missile showers were actually pretty limited, because that's, again, by definition, what light troops can do. Not much. They're not decisive by definition. And so, yes, the Turks could be annoying. There was a psychological component to this, especially not seeing where the heavies were, especially in this, Near Eastern scenarios with dust and the good season, etc. You always see these, swarms of Turkic lights approaching and provoking you, and at that point, that's quite frustrating, even for very well disciplined heavy horsemen. But the idea is that if you go out there into nothingness, you're basically going to charge into nothing, because these people do not even fight in a battle line. Or at least they do, but it's a much softer one, and the swarms of horse archers basically do that at a small unit tactics altogether, yes, along the line, but also not being as hard as, in fact, the ultimate reserve, that not necessarily, even in case of a almost essentially one battle, can deliver the final blow. It's the case of the Battle of Manzikert, right? At that point, the Byzantines managed to retreat across the kilometers that they had covered during the day, which was insane. It tells you actually how well, disciplined and performing Western systems were compared to the Seljuk ones that cannot break the army, cannot fully break the army. Yes, it's a disaster, but still the army is in part intact, returning home. And so at times, also the Crusaders get completely annihilated. That's mostly a matter of when a battle ends, that's what literally happens. The entire system normally crumbles. But sometimes you realize that there isn't even a capacity, like shock, ultimate, like tip of the balance action that horse archery, numerically based armies can't really do against the Western heavies, because also the Frankish infantries were pretty darn good, as we were saying before, between, say, the sergeants, the crossbowmen. You really have, like the, we were saying before, the Franco-Roman culture was immense in its capacity. Some scholar pointed out that essentially, there were phases in ways, especially tactics, would develop. It is partly true, like if you look at the bigger timeline, yes, but you can't really pinpoint, say, between the late 11th century, the beginning of the Crusades, and sort of 50 years before what say, the general enemies that had been met by the Westerners would have really influenced their kind of warfare. There is a whole historiographical branch that developed, like, mostly in the, it was always in the air in a way, but I think it was overly stressed in the second half of the 20th century. It basically pointed out that, or at least wanted to see, let's put it in this way, a sort of Eastern influence from the Crusades into Western warfare, right? That, however, was essentially crystallized in terms like, I don't know, this technology was imported in the West from the Crusades because these other people used it. I personally studied now medieval warfare and also that era, etc., in great, say, extension, let's put it in this way, and in some cases in great depth here and there, and I haven't found even a single proof that, say, the Western way of war, as also the Eastern way of war, was just like a simple product of some mutual influence by some radical degree. First of all, these peoples at large fought in very similar ways. We've seen it recently, for example, in that video about medieval Egyptian warfare that shows you how the Levantine areas of the Mediterranean were much more similar to Europe in terms of warfare than, they were at least a hybrid with a more Oriental, Central Asian, Persian influenced tradition, right? And secondly, that even technology does, in history of technology, even aside from the battlefields that really show a Western superiority that cannot be explained otherwise. Yes, again, superiority doesn't mean that you can't lose, you can't be defeated, you can't lose battles, etc. But I mean, at large, if anything, what we just explained about horse archery, like this is a post-Vietnam trauma, like the sense that the West cannot win against guerrilla BS. That there is countless evidence how you do that. And this is not even guerrilla, by the way. And whoever fights in a guerrilla style, like it's of course choosing to fight in a hard kind of war, but it's doing that from a condition of strategic inferiority. If you are equal to your opponent, you don't have all the time, or you don't lose the opportunity to meet him in open field and crush him with a punching force, right? If you need to withdraw, if you need to just refuse the center, like also the Mongols, they're like, it's not because, oh my god, you're just going to win because you're a genius, invented these tactics and the others do not know better. No, like that's just, if you win, it's a fruit of exceptional leadership, exceptional collective training, experience, whatever. But if you had been stronger in that sense than your enemy at the moment, you would have used the center to smash into the enemy one and breaking it, like the Westerners did, and you did not, right? So again, combined arms tactics, if you know how to perform them, okay, but it's also a relative overcomplication. Westerners, from their side, have, again, if anything, the issue of weight, of mobility, of reduced mobility, that they need to be, so they're relatively more exposed. But again, because they can afford that, right? Otherwise, they would have never fought in that way, right? So, some Fleury, for example, said that the couché, lance, and cavalry charges, at least I'm simplifying it, say the Conroy tactics overall, might have been more closely related to aristocratic prestige than to any intrinsic military advantage. I disagree with him because I believe that for the same reason why they were happening and they were to be essentially normalized, even though this is a relatively early age, I mean, we can still see that, I don't know, cavalry was more important than infantry in Europe since the mid-6th century. And that was the linear tendency, at least with, ups and downs, whatever, but still, right, and pretty uninterruptedly throughout the previous century. So it's, all these centuries up to the 12th, that you can't really say, well, you can't even pinpoint when is the first time that the couché lance grip was used. It was always used. It's not like you have to wait the 11th to the 12th century, too much time and words spent really on this non-problem. Like also in the 6th century they used that, also the Romans used. I mean, it's not like that, since we don't have the overwhelming evidence, the majority of evidence, they didn't do it, right? Again, in combat you do so many different things, and especially you'll be trained to pretty much like lots of different things at the same time. It's obvious that this was a time of great build-up, if anything. So that's definitely the case, and it should be better followed just from a broader political and social point of view, which we do normally in other videos. What goes in parallel with the development of these tactics, of course, are the tournaments, the torneamenta, a term that literally comes from turning, tourner, that is to turn, in fact, as the knight did after the charge to carry out another one, which is exactly what, your cat does. Why? When, he runs out of, he is exhausted, needs to ventilate, he flees to a safe place, and then he points to you once again, he breathes once again, he recovers energies, and then springs on the forward. Like, animals do this all the time. Humans do that all the time as well. The horses themselves are extremely aggressive. They're trained to punch, to kick, to bite. They can cause severe injuries to the opponents. And they were really like a spectacle to see. By the way, the myth that cavalry did not impact, this kind of BS that they tended to avoid the frontal charge, it's completely false. Like, there is no evidence whatsoever that this was the case. On the contrary, all armies, clashed frontally pretty well. You can argue, of course, that the stronger one could intimidate the others. It's not a merely material encounter, and the enemy will give way at a point. But these troops are homogeneously trained to some standards that make you clash into one another, like any kind of cavalry does. In every time in history we have plenty of evidence. Look at what happened with the French and the Russian cuirassiers at Austerlitz. Like, you could hear that literally the smashing of the armor of the bodies at miles of distance. This was all they did. Like, the entire point of why this tactic existed was to smash into one another regardless of the consequences. That's why you had to have massive balls that nobody today has. Even in sort of, yes, you will have in some military contexts as well, but I am starting to suspect that we're becoming ever more feeble, even as psychophysical standards and the way we actually wage war itself. Naturally, I've never fought in a war, so being in combat is of course a unique experience. But don't think that humans do not float in terms of actual combativeness over time. I have some interesting psychiatric insights on this, but I will research silently and then sort of come up with them at the right moment. By the way, the war horses, especially the stallion, the destrier, were chosen for that purpose. I mean, it is true that horses tend to avoid things, not to smash into them as humans do. But these horses are trained, like the humans, not to do that. Right? Actually, they are trained to launch themselves against the enemy. This even happens in nature. I mean, there is a certain amount of these animals that if you keep in a fence, at some point, just it will smash into that because they are overly loaded in testosterone. They need to vent in one way or another. And some of them, just psychologically speaking, are designed to be more aggressive and to be... and to understand very well, the horse is a radically intelligent animal. And so they perfectly understand you're bringing them in combat and they want to attack themselves, just like the knights do. Right? So these are specific breeds and, specimens and individuals that are designed like to be the most physically smashing of all the animals, right? And they would smash into any formation, right? We know this pretty well. First of all, there is no formation that automatically shelters you renders you immune from this type of charges, right? Of course, technology did help over time, but aside from the fact that, say, cavalry has a long history, the idea is that you can even have a mass of pikemen that are literally the only thing that will stop cavalry on foot before the gunpowder era, where still it's prevalently the pike that performs that role, of course, that the knights will charge into after having tested its resistance with prior charges and ways we'll see now, but that will actually charge into the pikes and break that freaking formation. That's all what they had to do as well, right? And the reason why, say, infantry was more effective, say, stopping cavalry charges starting from the beginning of the 14th century, there is a further fall in this capacity with the mid-14th century crisis. It's just 1 century later, really, that things really kick in once again back. Is moral force, is desperation, right? Is hatred, is all the motivation. It's political, it's moral, right? It's not what kind of weapons they use. Sometimes extremely primitive weapons that existed from a long time and that may have been more adapted, but they were alone insufficient to stop this cavalry. In fact, this does not go in parallel with technology. As a matter of fact, some of the places where cavalry gets defeated the most is the more underdeveloped fringes of Europe, the more decentralized ones, etc. And instead, where you have actually stronger infantries in absolute terms, you see cavalry still being decisive in spite of it. Because also nobody that can politically harness cavalry and infantry combined tactics will ever do without that, right? But it's moral forces at the end of the day that really matter. And if you follow Schwerpunkt, you know how important this really is. And there are different tasks here. For example, the tournaments, as we observed before, were the occasion where the newly made knights could be made. This is true also before battles. In fact, there was a strange practice, apparently, that was still relevant to spirit the audience. When, especially in the 13th century, the peak of chivalric culture, and in depth formation, one battle line went on fighting across the field that could be kilometers long, and these other lines were waiting. Literally, in order to entertain the knights, all lined up for battle, they would make the newly dubbed knights literally clashing in a tournament in front of the lines, which was also to foster their sense of belonging, etc. And we don't know much of the extremes of this, whether these guys, for example, would go into battle after that as well. But it was a great occasion to show off. It was so important for each of these men that represented, again, powerful houses. They were the establishment of Western Europe. Now, contemporary literature, especially after the mid-12th century and under the auspices of the courts of Champagne and Flanders, some of the most feudal ones ever, as well as the Angevin one, the Plantagenets, illustrates this phenomenon where tournaments and chivalric literature like that of Chrétien de Troyes, that I also made a video on regarding this chivalric ideals of tournament and more flourished. Again, I made multiple videos about this. You can check them out in the video about chivalry or knighthood. Chivalry is mostly like the literary side of the story is very important, but they're intertwined, right? You have Parsifal, you have really, again, beautiful passages. These were all, as you know, either Celtic or Germanic epic legions like that were eventually refined, like in the 12th century, being written down, booming, and being sort of fixed in a canon, but that were also product of centuries and centuries of warfare, not just of tales, right? Although Geoffroy de Preuilly is credited with inventing tournaments shortly before 1066, which is just an anecdote, their widespread appeal did not manifest until after 1100. De Preuilly may have just been a great organizer that would have enhanced certain things, would have surely been important, but just a name. Like, these things existed ever since ever. Like, think about the Astiludia in Carolingian times, or the Upica Gymnasia in Roman times. I mean, this is not even just about cavalry, by the way. It's just now reflecting, again, a military tradition. These exercises had always been kept alive. Now, the tournaments underwent significant evolution during the 12th century in particular, even in the face of the Church's criticisms, which perceived them as trivial imitations of real warfare. This is interesting because we get the sense that the Church at some point tried to ban the crossbows. It was sort of reactionary. There are so many cliches and so many misunderstandings. The story of the crossbow is false. I mean, the notion was that the crossbow did not have to spread among the masses of erratic infantrymen that were challenging the same cavalry at this point, which is a different thing from crusaders exterminating these infidels. Could really do this problem of the tournament as a sort of diversion from actual warfare is also kind of obvious, but it manifests exactly in the moment in which the tournament starts being something else, as say, other than training, paradoxically, because there was a time in which not even the Church would have problem with that way of training, as long as it was made to stiffen, of course, like the quality of these forces. Of course, the Church, as you know, heavily intervened Europe-wide, regardless of what the deep anti-Catholic hatred that exists among especially lesser people would like to make you believe historically. Like the Church, if you have any idea of the APC of medieval history, they stepped in every war all the time between Christians, saying, "Look, quit it." Right, that you can do much better than fighting against one another. It was always a great issue. Like I made videos about, for example, the penitentials throughout like early and high medieval history. You realize how in this apparently unregulated world, actually sins were taken very seriously by the same knights. When they killed someone, they had to atone for that, and they were actually even very disciplined. The Church was that important. And the ultimate, of course, imperial Catholic meaning of it all was incredibly crucial for people's salvations, exactly in holy combat. And it's just when the tournament becomes sort of a great display of luxury rather than else that the Church would say, like, why do you have these gatherings? And sort of they would understand. Also at that time, they would accept that as well. But it was like, why are you, just minding about your internal issues while there are the crusades going on, right? There's a kind of general attitude, but it's not like a general absolute ecclesiastical direction to simply blame these activities, right? Also because the local clergy would obviously understand why it was the case, and surely there were sins, there were abuses, there were wastes deriving from the activity. And it does make sense in as much as they were becoming like, why do you spend so much also for mock combat when you could settle matters also still in more productive ways. Now, until the close of the 12th century, tournaments bore little resemblance, as we've seen, to the grand jousts of later periods, where two knights armed with blunted weapons à plaisance would compete in an enclosed arena. Instead, these tournaments were more akin to genuine collective battles between competing factions, with one group, le Ceux du dehors, attempting to besiege another, le Ceux du dedans, that is to say, like those from the outside, those from the inside. This is interesting because it shows you also that it was not just like an open engagement, it was realistic in reproducing an actual siege of sort. And this again was often carried out by occupying private property of some sort, exactly to damage maybe some of the guys that were challenged from the other side. You understand how it wasn't like a mock combat at all, right? The knights employed strategies to block or lure their opponents into charges, set ambushes, and so to isolate individual knights on the opposing side, to unseat them and capture their horses, or more desirably, take knights hostage for ransom, which again is a thing when you're not fighting in the big engagement where you're actually going to kill one another for real. This is very important to stress because, especially in smaller engagements like this ones would be, again, the bigger battle in which you kill is because you're fighting a much more collectively drilled context with much bigger support, etc. Of course, again, most engagements would be similar to the ones of tournaments, but that's when random things happen, right? As we often point out, the bigger the engagement, the more balanced the odds. With smaller ones, you have Rambo kind of things, where you can have, randomly, things like, one guy defeating 10, right? It's also not very frequent in general, but it's still more possible statistically than in bigger engagements as a whole, right? And even in smaller engagements, you can have kind of that happening, but it's not the case in, say, you don't see it in bigger battles, right? In bigger numbers, right? In the bigger formation. Now, still, the core of these tournaments was the collective charge, right? Though individual acts of valor celebrated by jongleurs drew admiration and envy, promising glory and the potential for social advancement. This was still a hybrid era where, in fact, that possibility existed, also because, as we just said, this type of engagement sort of allowed somehow for them. They were complex engagements as well, so it's not just, again, the single smashing in open field, right? Tournaments, because by the way, you can break an enemy formation, but the enemy can run away, and if you don't have support, like, it's difficult even to simply chase them as you would like to, and so they can retreat in some places, they will entrench, and sort of lots of interesting things happen. Tournaments were similar to warfare, indeed, in their approach, acting as a systematic reenactment of battles marked by the intense public display. So there was also a bit more of exhibitionism, a bit more of sort of bravery displayed, but because gradually things were getting less bloody than they had been before. Nonetheless, these events were governed also by a set of rules and a code of conduct that was increasingly praised at this point in history. It's the one that we call chivalric. It was indeed an ideal. Much of what we think in this sense about courtly ethics or something like that was mostly like a political thing. It was not even about battles. And one problem is that the sources that tell us about this stuff, especially in this age, are largely not written by knights. And even when that is the case, if they are composed by knights, it is for some specific environments, and the few times we actually have an exceptional evidence of how these knights thought, actually, like, you realize that yes, it's not like these ideals were not present, but the practice of warfare was more habitually more, say, ruthless, and also because there was a hierarchy of value within the ranks. That's something we tend to sort of skip right? Because we have lost that sense of authority, of leadership, and say how important this was, like say in the war band, to have a leader who would behave in a certain way as opposed to the new initiate, right? We talked so much about ancient war bands between the Germanic comitatus, the Gaelic fiannas, etc., that it's useless to repeat oneself. We're very lucky to have those populations described by often also other peoples, the literate ones, to in fact tell us what was really the root of all European people's behavior, even up to a few centuries before, right? And we tend to look at the Middle Ages saying, well, that was not a thing anymore, because we sort of removed military history from the equation, and it's a military logic to begin with it, but there were different roles that had to be fulfilled. When we talk about the Battle of Markfeld, I will show you a beautiful example of how the ideal existed, but why it was bypassed, right? And in which context, of course, because you need the functionality of combat expressed there as well, from a moral point of view before then a technical one, and showing that everybody was able, however, to do when needed something unchivalric, right? Like William Marshall that kills like Richard Lioner's horse for broader political issue rather than like this was sort of harem move. You couldn't really kill among noblemen somebody else's horse, a war horse. That was the alter ego of the knight together with the sword. But there were also practicalities that had to be surpassed. Now, say elements of this system were also evident in real combat, even during significant engagements. For example, Orderic Vitalis. These are mostly ecclesiastical sources, especially if you remain more or less in the Anglo-French reality. It's very, 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 very feudal. In his chronicle of the Battle of Bremun, that we will have to look at, it's very interesting. This is in 1119. He observed that only 3 knights lost their lives, largely due to their effective protective equipment, such as mail. Right? This is a bit exaggerated, right? But it is true that at large, if a battle was fought with scarce conviction, or would say a unit would surrender quickly, or say people were able to escape, it depends on so many factors. But you see, a person reads this and says, so knights didn't die, right? And then you have all the other battles of the period telling you that this man died even in the hundreds at the point. So it's and not just against, say, Muslims, or because there was actually a chivalric bond with those as well. They were recognized feudal cultures, and then the heavily Persified Seljuk Turks had a lot in common with the Frankish, the Latin knights during the Crusades, right? It's Christianity and Islam did have some common background to that millenary tradition, as we were pointed out before. The passage, by the way, here is the ecclesiastical history, of course, of Orderic, 1218, in Latin, ferro enim undique vestiti erant, et pro timore Dei, notitiaque contuberni vicissim sibi percebent, nec tantum occidere fugentes, quam comprehendere stagebent, which adds this knightly unwillingness to take the lives of fellow warriors, demonstrating their capacity for mercy, which of course has to be an edifying conclusion in this circumstance. Now I will not go more in depth. So they prefer to capture fleeing adversaries rather than killing them. And at that point, like if the enemy is broken, cannot resist, of course that is very intelligent to do, if you can make so much money out of them. But it's not like they wouldn't actually die even in some of those circumstances, because hell, sometimes you really hate them and you want them dead, and you may profit politically or socially from their death, right? From a dynastic point of view, look, we've made so many videos about these incredibly harsh wars between, like, I don't know, the historical regions of France. We talk about all these dynasties that created, in many ways, the regions themselves as feudal states. And you've seen their continuous warfare of, like, this wasn't really that clean on a regular basis at all. So in this context, tournaments significantly influenced the development of the chivalric ideals, as you understand. And so the sense was also enhancing camaraderie on the battlefield, yes, but it was also about recognizing one another, right, in sense of establishment, this sense of chivalry we see surviving throughout all the Ancien regime because of the benefits that could derive from this shared treatment, right? We've seen it in the video about the musketeers of the Maison du Roi in France, for example, the famous events of the Battle of Fontenoy, both at the beginning and at the end of the battle. You realize the nobility did care about one another because it was a way to consolidate their power further in that role. But it's not like they weren't dying, in fact, on the contrary, like they were asking each other to shoot first, and bullets are really blind. It's not our era, evidently, but also pretty severely wounded officers would sort of exchange doctors. Powerful people, by the way, at the head of states at large, at least part of that establishment, saving each other's life after they had beaten each other, and lots of those noblemen had actually died in combat. This is actually the case for the 12th century as well, but it's much more brutal than you imagine in general, even when this code exists, or at least it's sort of codified in a literary sense at this point, but it existed before. It was all a system of values that was exactly designed to recognize the nobility since ever, right? The tournaments offered, as we've seen, a platform for refining tactical abilities and fostering unity and discipline among knightly groups, the convoi, strengthened by their shared experiences and training. That was the most important thing. Practicing over and over and over again, especially also under somebody's eyes, like your future wife, for example, a rich widower. That was sort of the quickest way also to rise up through the social ladder. Indeed, the camaraderie cultivated during tournaments was more pronounced than in less formal training exercises, such as Behoud and Quintaine that took place in castle courtyards. And so this had to do with specifically also training, like developing specific skills. And yeah, these things would be brought to the public eye at some point as well. There are so many festivals in Europe in which we do this stuff still. But indeed, like how important change over time. Somebody wanted to test oneself, like it depends. Like somebody even started to make a living with tournaments, as we know. So this sense of brotherhood among knights loyal to the same lord, at least, was a very old thing in the European war bands, and it was simply persisting now throughout the ages and adapting to the different political and social circumstances. It was a great way of self-promoting, because the idea of being a knight was now entering like the higher nature of the perennial valor, right, and honor in an ideal, right? This had to do again with the aforementioned separation of humans and men, right? And it belongs to the doctrine of the two natures that I made a video on, explaining sort of how it was all one with the concept of the empire and world domination, and of course like the divine duty of reuniting this world in God's might. That the knights were called, right? There is a beautiful passage, I think it was not Cliche, I think it was Parsifal, when yes, he sees the knights crossing a forest and says, these are angels that kill everything they touch, right? Or at least his mother, I think, before say, trying to keep him, as you know, distant from that lifestyle, tells him to scare him. And that was sort of true, but that's also the way to actual manhood, right? Maturity. Tournaments also led to the creation of unique insignias, colors, and heraldic symbols. Heraldry would not really become a veritable subject until discipline until the 16th century. It's more like a modern than a medieval thing, but surely, and we have covered this topic in different videos, including the one about the kite-shaped shield, still patterns. I mean, that is between the 11th to 12th centuries. It's really right for this video. We're becoming more evident. There were original symbols that now were more codified, and so it's always the same story. It's not like they didn't exist before. Actually, before these times, the original meaning was even more alive, but now it was functionalized to another purpose, or at least one that was differently vehiculated. That's when the concept of arms of a single knight or a single house starts consolidating. Right, this highlights the knightly noble character and further solidifies the unity of this estate. It's crucial to recognize that this chivalric solidarity did not eliminate social hierarchies. Right, it did not blur the distinctions between household knights, such as the milites gregari. I made one video about Henry I of England once, and the lords who employed them. You understand that this distinction, for example, through the arms, also was relevant from a strictly tactical point of view. I mean, all the convoy were sort of under different banners. You would have to recognize one another. It would be a way, again, to actually save your life, because if you didn't really get yourself recognized, you could get killed, because you may have not been recognized in your worth. And so this is yet another proof that these combats were actually pretty brutal, and that actually the art of war itself was becoming ever deadlier, telling the truth. So there was nothing really to kid about this all. Again, there is an entire 12th century history playlist that you can look at in this regard. Many examples of the brutality of that century, regardless of these apparent niceties. And so you realize that even in the context of combat or tournaments, the valor, the physical skill, the combat abilities of a knight often took precedence over noble lineage or wealth, and that was considered to be fair, at least to an extent, inasmuch those who won were really the ones God had chosen to bestow victory upon out of sheer virtue and accomplishment. And this was a way to select the best knights to begin with. You wanted them in your retinue. You would even fight over them, in a sense, as a lord. And this is really very evident and clear in think about the Arthurian legend and sort of this esoteric 12 symbolism of the various knights, their qualities, and there is a sense of unity, of compaction. They have to act all as one, and therefore being ever more performing. And they cost a lot. Especially if you're part of your household, you have to reward them in some way. You have to, hopefully, there is also a genetic principle. Like if these men are able to settle down and generate other offspring, especially in the earlier period when warfare was more down to the individual. So it was always down to the collective one in every era. But let's say you can argue that in the 11th century, even your physicality was more important than in the 13th century, right? For obvious reasons, because armies were smaller, individuals were more important, and everything was much less mediated by the collective. So it's all like the hope you would have faithful knights in next generation that stem from this biological specimen that is very interesting. also in the way to select further, literally from a racial point of view, these individuals. Furthermore, tournaments offered lower-ranking knights or younger sons a chance for social advancement. To begin with, they had to prove themselves as mature, like the youth of these knights could last for a very long time, well beyond their actual biological age, say conventional overlapping, right, with the same. This was the case for William Marshall, like he was already a mature, like a sort of middle-aged man by the time he ceased to be a youth and settled down. But this starts being ever more a political, juridical, feudal, social matter rather than, say, a biological one. A poor knight, let's say, without land, or so somebody who was actually not poor, had been raised into an actual feudal household, but he had not received land yet, or had therefore set out there to adventure, and there was an early attempt here to concentrate, power in the elder sons, and so you could have this younger, disinherited son that would maybe capture the attention of a prince through proven skill and bravery, just touring the world, and there are many examples of different knights. Also think about the Ostsiedlung, or in general, like the same, I don't know how many Western knights were at the service of Hungary, or the Byzantine Empire, or even some Islamic power. We've seen it often, like they went pretty far and wide, and the idea was to earn some reputation and riches and power in general. And it was actually a very harsh life. Like they would often come back without nothing, if not their experience. So that it was actually a terrible life if you think about the sheer effort that it required. But in a spiritual, in a moral sense, in a human sense, you can't really ask yourself whether it would have not been better to live this life than our own. The sense was, of course, at the end of the day, earning a place among the Lord's knights and fighting under the Lord's banner. This would result in a more secure future for everybody involved. It was a negotiable practice here involved. The vassus, the senior, the mixtio manum, this was all part of the vassalatic beneficiary investiture, for example. So there was also overlapping with dubbing, at least in the formal ritual with which this normally occurred. An imperium, an investiture, was being confirmed. A young so-called bachelor, that is the single less privileged man, might also aim to win over a wealthy heiress, or also her father's military protection through his accomplishment, potentially leading to marriage with her. And historical literature is replete with such narratives. The entire sense of courtly love is, very renowned, and again also idealized, but definitely corresponding to those codes of conduct that were all panels of the general societal discipline, the sense of hierarchy and authority, the forming states, and so it was incredibly important to foster these clienterly relations in order to have, if anything, that military backbone that would allow you to create a veritable feudal seigneury. While these opportunities were indeed infrequent in the sense that at least many knights would compete and not all of them would become great lords, right? Many of them would die as well in the effort. They highlight that social mobility was still achievable by the late 12th century, right? Even like in the moment in which everything was sort of being locked, right? Or even afterwards. But this was now more limited, right? At this time, the nobility proper, rather than the aristocracy, had increasingly dominated the knightly class. There was a real class, right? You had really now to be up to, like, again, you had to possess a certain set of power, of skills. Like, it could not be just anyone trying, right? But again, there was already, like, in the general still very primitive warfare of the time. It's not before the 13th century there is a monetization of the system. It was still a world based on, say, natural goods, on barter, like, at least not quite in a sense, but I mean, even kings in a way lived as in very brutal, right, sort of primitive ways. And so it's only from this time onwards the courts really start becoming something more concrete, more regulated, more permanent in their, at least, possibility of touring like a much broader country and interacting with the local establishment that is made up of knights, right? And so regulating access to knighthood and transforming it into an aristocratic profession characterized by its own ideals, but still, in fact, within a very rigid hierarchy and code of conduct that is necessary, as it is necessary just to achieve those marvelous cavalry charges. And ultimately it was through marriage, as we've seen, rather than knighthood itself, that individuals typically gained entry into the nobility, because through that you could simply, make so much money like you would have never seen in an actual life of combat, right? But it was still true that, like, knighthood was instrumental in facilitating and promoting such noble unions, right? Bernard de Clairvaux, in his Vita Sancti Malachies, is quite open about this. And in fact, as you know, as we were remembering at the beginning, he was also criticizing the more habitual ways knights would sort of achieve these unions. There is a great hypocrisy, there is a great violence, there is a great, like, opportunism. But it's still part of the selection. That's how this man would see the business. And again, it's a pity that at large we do not have, for this time, this enormous, say, direct evidence of this individual's voices. But knowing their lifestyle, we also know how really this could be, to a degree, how violent but still sort of rational, right? That never make the mistake of considering war irrational, right? Politics uses it, and politics, regardless again of what's the disadvantage to think, it's actually the most rational component of the entire society. People are not better at all, right? And at best you have a continuous degeneration along that pattern, regardless of science. And so you understand how much there is here at stake for everybody involved. Otherwise, you wouldn't even see the need of all this specific training, of all this specific effort, this perennially military lifestyle that is also really loved as such. But you can argue that there is a great deal of belief in the higher value of such activities, and you really can't hide that. You really can't unsee how relevant this really was for them and for others too in this society. How crucial, how fundamental these knights really were, right? So for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.